Welcome, everybody. My name is Mark Canavera. I'm the Associate Director of the CPC Learning Network, and we're just delighted that you have joined us this morning, afternoon, evening, or nighttime from wherever you are in the world to learn about a study that we've entitled Change That Counts. This webinar will present the results from the follow-up study of a community-led intervention to reduce teenage pregnancy in Sierra Leone. We have two illustrious speakers with us today. One is Dr. Lindsay Stark, who is the director of the CPC Learning Network, so my supervisor, if you put the dots together between my title and hers, and Sarah Lilley, who's the deputy head of child protection at Save the Children UK, and is also the coordinator of the Interagency Learning Initiative on community-based child protection mechanisms and child protection systems. I would also note this is a triply co-hosted webinar between three entities, which are that Interagency Learning Initiative on community-based child protection mechanisms, whose Community Child Protection Exchange serves as the forum for discussing these events. The coordinator of the Community Child Protection Exchange, Lucy Hillier, was supposed to be moderating this and is having technical difficulties. So if you're listening in from the phone line, Lucy, you're with us in spirit, and I'm really sorry that it's me talking and not you, for the participants as well as for you. The Community Child Protection Exchange is also joined by us, the CPC Learning Network, whose secretariat's housed at Columbia University, and the CP-MERG, which stands for the Child Protection Monitoring and Evaluation Reference Group, which is another interagency initiative to promote improved monitoring and evaluation for child protection. So the three of us have come together to share this specific study, which is part of a broader initiative, not only in Sierra Leone, but globally. A second phase of this has started in Kenya as well. For those of you listening, you may be familiar with Dr. Mike Wessels, who is the academic who is probably most well known for presenting this. And because of our webinar platform, we aren't able to have people raise their hands and do smiley faces, but I'm sure if Mike is with us, everybody would be clicking on smiley faces and applauding right now. This broader initiative really is looking at what communities are doing to protect and to care for children in communities in Sierra Leone, and involves a number of measurement aspects. It's been a very, very sophisticated interagency process that has involved a number of measurement tools over time, and we are presenting one of those today. A few logistical things. During the webinar, we do encourage you to send us questions for the presenters. You can do that either through the chat or the question box, which Ghazal Kashavarzian of the CP-MERG will be keeping an eye on to make sure that we feed them back to the presenters. You can use the chat function to discuss related issues with other listeners, and it will also be moderated like the questions. Please note that you must use the chat or the question functions to ask questions. You'll be able to hear us, but you won't be able to see us. You will be able to see some of the presenter slides, but you won't be able to use audio to speak during the webinar. Finally, please note that this webinar will be recorded and posted on the CPC Learning Network's YouTube channel soon after the event, so this will be kept for posterity. If you would like to read more about the broader initiative, there is a summary of the work that's been undertaken in Sierra Leone and links to a number of very, very interesting reports on the website of the Community Child Protection Exchange. This website address is childprotectionforum.org. We wanted to have that on a slide for you to see, but we don't, so let me say it one more time. It's childprotectionforum.org, and you would click on the webinars link. Two last things. One is to please familiar yourself with the question and chat function. Normally this is located on your control panel box to the right of the screen. please do shoot an email to Maya, who you should have received the confirmation registration email for this from if you're having difficulty with that. And also, if you're having difficulty hearing or listening, for listening purposes, you can use the sound check button under audio on the control panel. With no further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Lindsay Stark, who is the director of the CPC Learning Network and the lead methodologist in developing this survey to measure children's well-being. You've already received a relatively lengthy biography of Lindsay, so I'll turn this over to her momentarily. But I just wanted to say that one of the things that I know about Lindsay is that she's very passionate about trying new methods to measure things that have been difficult to measure or that we've thought have been impossible to measure. And this is, something that really invigorates her, and I think you're going to hear about what we're learning about using this particular method in this setting. A final word before I turn it over to Lindsay, and that is we've already received some questions about how this relates to the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone. And Lindsay will touch on that at the end of her presentation and what the strengths and weaknesses of the method that we've used are moving forward in knowing how to best support communities. But I would add that this is looking backwards in time at 2 data points in the past, so it is not primarily focused on the Ebola outbreak that I know is impacting so many people in Sierra Leone and the West African subregion and the world, and that we will want to be thinking through how we can best adapt this initiative to that major change in the region's dynamics. Over to you, Lindsay. I look forward to hearing this.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that introduction. So for those of you who don't know, I'm just going to start by giving a little bit more detail on the origins and the history of this project and how it came into being. In 2009, Mike Wessels, on behalf of an interagency group, undertook a structured review to look at the evidence base on what works to strengthen community responses to various child protection concerns. The primary finding that came out of that study was that we really don't know a whole lot. The evidence base is extremely weak. The methodologies that have been used to try to measure effectiveness of community-based interventions have been very limited. And so growing out of that study and that important finding, there was an establishment of an interagency learning initiative on community-based child protection mechanisms and child protection systems, which just rolls off the tongue, I know. This is coordinated by Sarah Lilley, who is with us today, and right now is overseeing multi-year projects both in Sierra Leone and in Kenya. And both of these projects contain a couple of key elements. The first is an action component where communities themselves are thinking through and deciding what child protection concerns they want to address and how they can address those through strengthening their own community-based mechanisms and linking those mechanisms with the government and the wider national child protection system. And this component is overlaid by an evaluation component, which then is intended using mixed methodologies to measure the impact of the community-based interventions on specific child protection outcomes. The work in Sierra Leone has undergone a number of different phases, beginning in January of 2011 with ethnographic research. As Mark mentioned earlier, actually a lot of the phases of the work that you see here on this slide have already been written up, and you can find those reports on the Community Exchange website, on the CPC website, and elsewhere. In the ethnographic study, our local researchers lived and worked in the communities of focus to try to work together with the communities to unpack notions of childhood, what the key child protection issues of concern in those specific communities were and are, and what communities were already doing to help mitigate and prevent those protection concerns. This initial phase was then followed by a second phase, which included and focused on an elicitation of locally defined outcomes of child well-being. So trying to understand, what does a well child look like in your community, or what does a child look like who's not doing well, and what are some of the key indicators around that. In February of 2012, we undertook our first baseline survey, which was a quantitative measure, which I'll talk more about in a second, in all of our communities. And this was followed by an extensive process of community dialogue, where the communities reflected back on the findings from the initial phases of the research and discussed and came together to decide what child protection issue they specifically wanted to focus on and develop an intervention for. And in Sierra Leone, the issue of focus was identified as teenage pregnancy out of wedlock. This process of community dialogue needed, and we wanted to give it the time that it deserved, and so it actually went on for a long enough time that we felt like we needed to go back after the communities had finally identified the issue to collect a bit more detailed baseline information related to teenage pregnancy and attitudes and knowledge around sex and contraception and STIs, to be able to move forward and make sure we're also able to measure relevant outcomes related to the intervention itself. So there was a second survey in February 2013, and this was followed by a rollout of the intervention that the communities led, and I'll share a little bit more about that. And in November of 2013, our research team went back for a 9-month follow-up survey to try to begin to understand trends and patterns that were emerging, specifically around the intervention. You can see that the last phase of research listed here is another phase of data collection, which was scheduled for November of this coming year. Obviously, with the Ebola crisis, that has been delayed indefinitely. So I'll speak a little bit about that at the end and some of the implications for this work moving forward. This slide presents generally the same idea as the last slide in sort of mapping out the different phases of the research and the work, but shares a little bit more specifics on the identification and breakdown of the communities themselves. So you can see that the intervention areas have focused on 2 districts, Bombali District and Moyamba District, and these were selected by an interagency group in Sierra Leone. And within those 2 districts, each of those districts selected 2 chiefdoms to be the areas of focus, and within each chiefdom, 3 matched villages were selected. And those 3 clusters of villages, were either randomly assigned to be the intervention group or the comparison group, with the idea being that if the intervention did show and seem to be effective, that there would be a future attempt to raise funds to roll out the intervention in the comparison villages as well. The intervention itself aims to change social norms in ways that support a reduction of teen pregnancy through processes of dialogue, through learning about sex and pregnancy prevention, through peer messaging by means such as drama, song, role modeling, access to and use of contraceptives, and collective decision-making. And this has been guided in particular by the adolescents themselves, acting with the support of elders and leaders, as well as support from some outside NGOs, including Marie Stopes and Restless Development. The overall research question that we are asking through the evaluation is whether community-driven child protection mechanisms that have strong linkages with the formal system reduce the incidence of teen pregnancy and improve wider child protection outcomes. So I want to share just a little bit about the methodology. During the first baseline survey, we actually conducted a census of 530 young people between the ages of 13 and 19. and invited them to participate in the study. And when we went back approximately 9 months after the intervention had begun, approximately 52% of those we interviewed initially were found and re-interviewed. And the remaining youth who you see here in this 574 total were made up of either younger children who had now aged into the cohort, so who may have been 11 or 12 at the time of initial data collection, but who are now 13 and eligible to be interviewed, or children who had moved into the communities and potentially had been exposed to the intervention, so they were also invited to participate. The survey itself was administered using smartphone technology and focused on a range of questions that drew both from international instruments that are considered to be best practice, and also integrated questions based on the previous phases of research that elicited more local language and local understandings of well-being. The primary categories looked at personal demographics, knowledge and attitudes towards contraception and HIV/AIDS, access to contraception and information about sex, relationships, and pregnancy, peer and community attitudes towards sex and teen pregnancy, exposure to the intervention itself, and other child protection concerns, including violence, schooling, and a variety of other areas. The data collection for the T2, for the midline data, was collected in December of 2013 by 12 researchers, and most of those researchers had also been involved in the baseline evaluation, and many had also been involved in earlier stages of the research. And this is an important point for us in terms of the trust and rapport that our research team has been building over time with the communities, so that when they come and show up, they're not necessarily strangers asking strange questions, but they're known, they're trusted by the local community. All of the researchers participated in a rigorous 2-week training in Freetown, which included instructions on consent, ethics, and appropriate interviewing techniques for children, and there was extensive field testing on the tool as well. So I want to share just a couple of slides that actually came out of the baseline study before we move on to the midline results. This first chart I know is quite busy, but it really compares at baseline the overall demographics between the intervention clusters, which you can see in this column, and the comparison clusters, which you can see in this column for both Lilley and for Moyamba. Of course, for our ideal at baseline is for these clusters to be as similar as possible across intervention and comparison, so that over time, as we see changes, we can attribute those changes to the intervention and not due to some varying characteristics within the population. In Moyamba, there were some differences observed for relation status and religion, and in Lilley, there were differences observed for religion, but by and large, the characteristics of the sample looked quite similar. The next two slides really, I think, give you a picture of how critical a problem teen pregnancy is in these communities, and why it is indeed an issue that communities rightly selected to focus on and have critical concerns about. Nearly half of all young people at baseline reported that they were in relationships and sexually active. And this slide shows the proportions of sexually active children by age. And you can see that children as young as 13 years old, nearly 1 in 10 of those children are sexually active. And by the time children and adolescents reached the 18 and 19 years old, approximately 85% of them were engaged in sexual activity. This is even more alarming when we look at the next slide, which looks at recent sexual activity and pregnancy in the past 12 months. We performed a logistic regression that looked at the strength of association between pregnancy and age. And what we found is that for every additional year following sexual debut, so for every year after a girl or a boy has had sex, there is a 50% increase in their odds of having had a recent pregnancy. So that's a pretty staggering number. In addition, not attending school in the preceding year was also associated with a 4-fold increase in the odds of having had a recent pregnancy. So this suggests a quite strong association between teen pregnancy and school dropout. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given the high pregnancy rates reported at the baseline period, more than a third of the adolescents in the sample could not name ways in which people could avoid a pregnancy. So now I just want to share some of the midline results, some of what our early data is telling us about how the intervention is affecting these issues of concern. The first finding that I want to share was that adolescents in intervention areas reported being more willing to ask their partner to use a condom. So you can see here the intervention line is the blue line and the control line. The comparison community is represented by the red line. And while the control line generally stayed the same, at the second time of data collection, we saw a pretty drastic increase in the intervention group. And that is in response to this specific question. Respondents were asked to indicate their level of agreement with the following statement: I would not ask a sex partner to use a condom because I would be criticized or made fun of. So there's been a lot of work around peer modeling and role playing around negotiation, and so this seems to have there seems to be some early preliminary evidence that this is effective in terms of willingness to ask a partner to use a condom. This next slide is an interesting one, and to me speaks to the importance of having a control group, and I'll have another slide in a few minutes that tells a similar story. So if we only had looked at access to contraceptives, which is what this chart is looking at, in our intervention group, we would be patting ourselves on the back and throwing our hats in the air and saying, wonderful, these communities have figured it out. This intervention seems to be quite effective, and adolescents know and are able to access contraceptives much more easily now as a result of our intervention. But the control line is a really important one in this case, and it shows a very similar trend. And so this suggests that it is actually maybe not our intervention that is increasing access to contraceptives, and this may be a result of changes that are going on nationally or at the district level. There are a number of awareness campaigns right now in Sierra Leone to reduce teen pregnancy. It is a critical issue. So while our intervention may be part of what's helping children in the communities where we're engaged, it seems to not be the only thing, the only piece of the puzzle. This slide, on the other hand, tells a bit of a different story. So this particular chart that I've showed here looks at teenagers in intervention areas being increasingly likely to use condoms regularly. And this gets to a really important issue around behavioral intent. So for social scientists, in addition to looking at knowledge and attitudes as early predictors around behavior change, behavioral intent is actually a really, really important marker in terms of early plans for behavior change. And so when asked whether they plan to use condoms regularly, there was an increase of 5.8 percentage points in teenagers who said yes at T2 in intervention areas, while there was actually a decrease of 9.7 percentage points for those who said yes in control areas. And importantly, this finding was particularly true both for girls, for females, and for those children, both boys and girls, under 15. So really a demographic that we would want our intervention to be targeting. It was also found that teenagers who had been exposed to the intervention were nearly twice as likely to report an intent to turn down sex with someone they do not want to have sex with, compared with children in the control group and comparison group. So again, these are sort of early but important indicators of behavioral intent, which we think will be a predictor of behavior change in future rounds of data. And a final finding that I wanted to share here is looking at how teenagers in controlled villages had increased levels of sexual activity. So this sort of paints the opposite picture to the two slides that I showed you previously. So if we only had the intervention group to look at without the control, we would think that this was actually pretty static, and children, were having sex at the same rate, and our intervention, the intervention that was being led by the community, was not having much of an impact. But when we look at that compared to the comparison group, actually the trend in the comparison group is upwards, and so more young people are starting to engage in sexual activity in the comparison groups. So it's not a terribly strong correlation connection here, but it shows that the intervention actually might be somewhat protective in preventing the intervention group from also having increased rates of sex in the last year. This is a busy slide, I know, but this represents the overall theory of change that is underlying the intervention. And I just wanted to present this and share this in light of the findings that I just discussed. So if we look at the bottom section, we can see the different elements of the intervention that are represented there. And if we move on up to the green area, to the outcomes, we can see that delay in first sex, increased use of contraception, increased discussions and negotiations by young people about sex. A lot of the outcomes here are the ones that we're beginning to see effects for at the midline evaluation. So it seems to be following our predicted theory of change, which we hope would then continue moving up the ladder towards impact, which is reduction in teen pregnancy. Following the T2 data collection that happened 9 months after follow-up, there was recently a participatory qualitative evaluation in the communities, and within those discussions there seemed to be some optimism about reduction in teen pregnancy in the intervention areas. So again, we don't have the quantitative data yet to back that up, but it seems promising. And I just wanted to end, I don't think I can give this talk without at least mentioning and thinking about what this means in light of the current Ebola crisis. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, our T3 final round of data collection has been put on hold due to the Ebola crisis. We certainly hope that we will have the opportunity to go back and to collect that data. But we also need to recognize, what it means to do this kind of research in real settings with real issues, and Ebola is certainly one of those. So it is possible that, and if we went back and were able to conduct T3, we'd have to think about the different ways that the Ebola crisis may have affected these communities. And so it is possible, for example, that the Ebola messaging within Sierra Leone to avoid touch and to avoid contact may actually be driving down rates of sexual activity among young people, and so we might end up seeing lower trends across the board because of that. On the other hand, it could be that children are more vulnerable. We've heard some stories anecdotally about girls being forced into coercive sex or transactional sex as a result of new vulnerabilities coming from the Ebola crisis. So it would be important for us to think through how the Ebola crisis has potentially affected these communities, and think about how that might be affecting the data that we would look at. At the same time, I think there's some interesting things to be looked at as well in terms of whether the community cohesion that has formed as a result of the locally derived interventions has actually been a protective measure around some of the child protection concerns, and so that's something that I think we could probably go back and look at. And finally, I think we do actually have a rather unique opportunity here. We do have a lot of good data collected at multiple data points before the Ebola outbreak, and we can hopefully go back to these communities after and really use quantitative and qualitative methods to understand how things have shifted and how child protection issues may be exacerbated and in what ways through a follow-up survey. So I'm going to leave it there and turn this over to Sarah, and then I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindsay. And before we let Sarah take the reins, I of course want to give a proper introduction. And in reading through the biography of Sarah that we received for this webinar, I learned something new, despite having worked with Sarah for years, which is it's always exciting to learn new things about people. And before I turn to that biography, please just do send questions through the question box or the chat function on the right side of your screen, or wherever you have placed it now by clicking and dragging around. And those will be collated and brought to both Sarah and Lindsay at the end for a discussion. Turning to our respondent, Sarah Lilley is currently the Deputy Head of Child Protection at Save the Children UK, and is also the coordinator of the Interagency Learning Initiative on community-based child protection mechanisms and child protection systems, through which she's been working with Lindsay on the Sierra Leone research, as well as many other researchers. Prior to this, she was the Child Protection Learning and Impact Advisor at Save the Children UK. Sarah has also worked as an economist for the UK government, focusing on monitoring and evaluation of national child protection and education policy and interventions. Prior to this, Sarah worked as a research assistant for a Commonwealth Development Organization. And that is what I learned new about Sarah today. And with that, we will hear from Sarah her thoughts. And just to situate this a tiny bit more, one of the reasons that as we organize this between the three entities, we thought to reach out to Sarah is that she is somebody who, as the coordinator of this initiative, has had a bird's eye view over many years and has seen this process through many phases. And we're very interested to get some reflections from her at this stage, which is quite advanced in Sierra Leone now. And so it is in that capacity that we invited her, and we are really looking forward to what she has to say. Over to you, Sarah.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark, for that introduction, and thank you, Lindsay, for such a clear presentation on the findings that we've been seeing from the work in Sierra Leone. So I've just got, I guess, a couple of takeaways, really, that I wanted to reflect on. And the first is really thinking about implications of this piece of work for the way that we evaluate child protection interventions. So I'd like to just share a few thoughts about kind of stepping back, what we can take from this and apply to other evaluations that we might be doing in the child protection field. And then I've got a second slide, which is just looking at the implications for child protection programming, and particularly thinking about system strengthening from what we're seeing in Sierra Leone and from what we're also kind of beginning to see from the work in Kenya. So I'll just kind of summarize some key points in those two areas that I think it's kind of helpful to reflect on. So firstly, thinking about what can we take from this, and what are the implications for us going forward in terms of the way we evaluate child protection interventions. The first point I wanted to highlight is somewhat obvious, but I think it's worth saying. And I think this study really shows that it is possible to measure and evaluate child protection outcomes for children. So we've often heard in the child protection sector that child protection, it's too difficult to measure. We can't measure outcomes from these child protection programs. Things are intangible, and there's a lot of kind of challenge really laid around this area of evaluation in child protection. And I think that this piece of work, and partly this is why, part of the reason that we've done this piece of work, and particularly that we've done it on an interagency basis, is to kind of learn together and show that we can evaluate child protection interventions, and we can evaluate them in a robust way, and we can develop really useful and relevant and feasible measures for child protection outcomes. So I think that's kind of a first message that I reflect on when I look at this piece of work, is that it is possible to do this in a robust way. And coming to the second point on the slide, Lindsay, in the presentation of the T2 findings, presented particularly around the indicators that have been developed through the project on teenage pregnancy, because obviously that's so much linked to the main aim of what the communities had decided they wanted to focus on. If you get a chance to look at the longer reports, you'll see that we did also collect information on a broader range of child protection outcomes. So we've got information about teenage pregnancy related outcomes, but we've also developed and collected data on other child protection outcomes, like child labour, like violence against children, transactional sex. And what we want to be able to see is, as well as, does the intervention primarily have an impact on reducing teenage pregnancy, possibly does it also have secondary impacts on some of these other areas of child protection? And I think this is kind of really coming to the third bullet. I think it shows that it's really useful for whatever project we're looking at in child protection, that we develop and measure kind of holistic outcomes for children. So we can identify what are the primary things we're trying to change, and we can measure those. And we can also identify outcomes that might be secondary, that could be affected, that are also useful to look at and to evaluate the impact on. So I think pulling those pieces together, this study really shows that there are a range of different things in child protection that we can measure, and that we can measure well and evaluate through our project processes. So the second bullet, sorry, I'm doing these out of time, but the second bullet on this slide, as Lindsay mentioned, the process of developing the indicators for this project was quite an interesting one. There was work done with communities to identify indicators which were kind of locally defined about what is a well child, as Lindsay described, and then there were also indicators that were taken from international standards, particularly around teenage pregnancy and access to contraception. And these were combined into a survey for children and combined into a set of outcomes. And I think that's been really useful. And again, it's something, when we step back, that could be applied to a range of different child protection projects that we might be working on. And it highlights what we saw was that actually some things that communities value as important to measure in terms of the effect of programs is different to what we, sitting in agencies, sitting in the international kind of arena, consider as important. And actually that it is really useful for us to look at and measure both perspectives, so what's important to the community who are part of the project, and also what is important in terms of sector standards that we might want to measure. So I think that's, again, a kind of principle and a really useful approach that has been used in this project that we can step back and apply in other areas where we're doing evaluation of child protection work. The fourth, I guess, reflection on this project, which is a very practical one, was just around the way that we collected the data. And as Lindsay mentioned, in the T2, in the follow-up data collection, we used mobile phones, so smartphones, to actually collect the data in the field. We didn't do that in the baseline, and we haven't done it for earlier phases of the work, but it was incredibly helpful, and it made the process much more efficient and reduced the kind of errors that we were seeing in the data collection process. So it's a very practical learning, really, but something that I've reflected on working a lot in M&E in my day-to-day role. Just how useful it is to be integrating technology into the processes for data collection. And it's obviously not possible in every context, but I would say that we learned from Sierra Leone that you can, the survey questions that we were asking were on quite sensitive issues, but it didn't affect the rapport between the young person being interviewed and the interviewer to use a mobile phone, as far as we were able to tell. And we were in rural areas where access to energy and generators was not particularly easy, but we still managed to make it work. So I think that's something to reflect on again for thinking about how we design and conduct the process of data collection for evaluations for any child protection project that we're working with. And finally, just reflecting on the final point on evaluation. Again, it's kind of an obvious point really, but I think this project really demonstrates why it's so useful to have a robust evaluation design and what we can really get out of a design that is robust and what it can tell us, and how it is a lot better than some of the usual practice, I might say, of how we're operating in terms of conducting evaluations. So this design, as Lindsay described, had baseline data and follow-up data, so we can look at change. It also had the communities where the intervention was happening and data collection in the comparison communities. And Lindsay's already touched on why it's been so important to have that in terms of the way that we've interpreted the data. So again, it's really a general message that we can apply to any child protection project that we want to evaluate, that it really is important to build in the most robust design that's feasible and that's appropriate for the particular intervention that we're looking at. And I think this, again, in child protection, we've probably been a bit down on ourselves of, we haven't been able, it's very challenging to do this, and we've discussed a lot of ethical issues around having comparison communities, but I think this particular study shows, or this research shows that it can be done, and that there are ways that we can deal with some of the ethical and other challenges that we might face. So that's the implications that I wanted to highlight really for evaluation that I think are important. And then let's see if I can move to the next slide. Okay, I'm having a bit of trouble moving to the next slide. I'm wondering if perhaps Maya, who's supporting the webinar, could help me to perhaps unshare my screen, and then I can try to move the slide along. Sorry for this, it shouldn't take a minute.
I was going to start filling the gap, but I think we're almost there. Are we, Maya? I think so.
Okay, yes.
But very nice.
Yeah, sorry about that, everybody.
Screen that we're seeing there.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you very much, Maya. I think it's showing on your screen now, and we're just going to get it up to full size. So while Maya's doing that, I can start talking. So thanks, Maya. So the second area that I wanted to highlight really was the implications of this work for child protection programming and system strengthening. So thinking more about the actual intervention itself. And I just had a few points really to make about this. So firstly, I think when I reflect on, when I look at what we've been doing in Sierra Leone, my reflection is that the intervention is not drastically different from what we already do as a child protection community and as a sector. We're already working on community mobilisation in our programmes, and we already have elements of this type of intervention built into what we're already doing. But there are some important differences or adaptations, I think, on the way that we usually do things that this project is telling us or showing to us. that are important. So the first area I think that really comes out strongly from this particular model is that we've spent a lot more time than we might usually do at the outset of a project to understand what's actually happening in a community and community values and perspectives about child protection. As Lindsay showed in the kind of timetable of the work, we actually spent probably the first year really just setting up the intervention. So conducting the ethnographic research, which really went into kind of depth about understanding what was happening in the community and how child protection issues were being responded to. And allowing this time to understand the community's perspective and to enable them to really see the data as well that we collected and for them to reflect on it and to come up with their own work plan was really critical, we think, in building community ownership. And so I think that's something that's certainly within my organisation at Save the Children that is different from the way we normally do our community mobilisation programmes. It's really focusing more of that planning time in the early days to start with the community and understand where they're at and to work very closely with them to enable that ownership. The facilitators for this project who worked with the communities also spent what I would say is a lot more time really in the communities than we probably have in our usual community mobilisation programmes. So they actually lived in the communities for a few weeks during the ethnographic phase of work, and then during the kind of intervention planning they also stayed overnight. They spent I think it was 2 to 3 days per week in each community. So it was very intensive really at the start, and it enabled the facilitators to build a very good relationship with the community and to build up a lot of trust and understanding of what was actually happening in the community, so that from there we could then develop the intervention, or the community could develop the intervention, and we could have a really productive relationship together through the project. And I think again, you know, that's something that is a bit different from the way that we usually do things, but in our view and from what we see from T2 findings and the qualitative and feedback that we've had from community members, it has been really important. We've also, the facilitators themselves have received a lot of training and also mentoring, and again what we've seen has been really important has been their skill set and the way that they've been able to be very open-minded in their work with communities, to go in without bias, to be open to the community ownership and discussion and issues. And I think, again, stepping back and thinking about what this tells us for our day-to-day work in child protection, it is important that we really build facilitation skills, and it seems to be an important factor in driving success of community mobilisation work for child protection. Lastly on this, in terms of the model, as Lindsay described, the intervention essentially gave complete ownership of identifying the priority child protection issue to the community. So the community looked at the data that had been collected in the ethnographic phase and decided that teenage pregnancy was the issue that they wanted to work on. It wasn't driven by the agencies that are part of the initiative. It wasn't driven by the donors who are funding this project in terms of their priorities. So the issue itself was completely decided on by the community, and then they developed their work plan and the process for the intervention. And this has been, from the feedback we've had, this has been a really important factor affecting success. There is, I think, a consideration, because obviously it requires a lot of flexibility from a donor to be able to be completely open to a community driving a process, because you don't know when you start out what in fact it is you're going to be focusing on, or what the community are going to decide to focus the project intervention on. And that takes a certain, it takes a certain openness from donors and from agencies to be able to work in that way. So it may not be possible with in all situations, But I think it's been a really important factor that's we think contributed to the changes that we're seeing and to the relationship between the project and the communities that seems to be working really successfully. So again, kind of stepping back and thinking for the sector, it may be that we can't move in all community mobilisation to a completely community-owned process as we have in this model, but I think it's showing us that this is an important factor in driving effectiveness of interventions. So how we can consider increasing the level of ownership and moving towards community-owned and designed interventions is important if we want to have effective practice. So I'd just like to finish with the final point that this is one model that we've been piloting in Sierra Leone and which we'll be piloting in Kenya. But we absolutely need to pilot and robustly evaluate other approaches to working with communities and strengthening communities and strengthening the links between communities and wider child protection systems. Ideally, we'd love to have 10 of these kinds of action research projects going on in different agencies, testing different approaches, and then we'd be able to compare what's working best, what's appropriate in different contexts. We'd have an evidence base to make informed decisions about where we should be driving programming. So I guess that's just a kind of a thought for the future. It may be that people listening are already doing this, and that's wonderful. And I think across the child protection sector, we need to kind of draw together these approaches and evaluations that might be going on so that we can learn together in this way to take us forward. So there were some highlights. I think I've talked a little bit longer than intended, so sorry about that. But I'm looking forward to questions. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Sarah. That was an absolutely wonderful reflection on this process after several years in the making. And I'm glad you went over, because you are someone who has, as we said at the beginning, a bird's eye view of this entire process that hasn't, publicly shared your thoughts on this. So I think it's just wonderful to hear these thoughts. And your points all really resonated with me. And I think for our discussion, we've already had 4 questions come through, and please do continue to send. But I would like to put these to both of you, because I think you spoke to very different components of this process. And I think through these questions, hopefully, we can also start to draw some linkages between them. The first question that I hope that both of you will be able to speak to, and I hope you have your pens ready, because I'm just going to give you all 4 at once. One of our attendees was wondering what the research tells us about mechanisms like child protection committees. How effective are they in preventing teenage pregnancy or supporting young pregnant girls in comparison to using other models? And we'd mentioned that this whole process started out with a review of community-based child protection mechanisms globally, and then honing in on Sierra Leone and these specific communities, what various mechanisms were doing. And committees do appear in the broader process, but don't necessarily, I think, appear in the intervention. And maybe if you could speak a little bit to that, it would be great. Another attendee is wondering if a logic model would have worked instead of a theory of change. So perhaps a little bit on why a theory of change was proposed, and if a more typical logic model could have worked. Following on to that, another question. This one is from yours truly, Mark. If each of you could give us one lesson learned on developing outcome indicators, what would it be? I pose this to you because there were some quite, sophisticated processes and sophisticated outcome indicators for this specific piece of research. But secondly, Sarah, I know in a previous role you also developed the menu of outcome indicators. And if you don't, attendees have not seen that yet, I would immediately go to the Save the Children Resource Center and enter in the search function menu of outcome indicators, which to my mind is still the most user-friendly set of outcome indicators that child protection and family welfare actors have in the international humanitarian and development sector. So one key lesson around developing outcome indicators. Finally, this question came up before the webinar and we'll repeat it. In relation to the Ebola crisis, can the system strengthening community foundation aspects of the intervention provide lessons or ideas that we might apply to an Ebola response? And I know you'll speak to this, but very briefly, I would just add also, please, all of you, if you have not seen the story of Fatu, who's actually in Liberia, not Sierra Leone, but the local mechanism of gumboots and garbage bags that a 22-year-old nursing student designed to nurse her family back from the brink of death. It is a truly local mechanism for responding to the Ebola crisis, and a very beautiful story. It's FATU, so Google Fatu Ebola, and you will read a very beautiful story if you haven't already. With that, it's over to Lindsay and Sarah.
I guess I'll start.
Yeah,
I'll let Sarah.
Actually, do you want to start?
Oh, do you want to start, Sarah?
No, you go first.
I will start. All right, very good. So I'll start at the beginning. What does this research tell us about child protection committees in relation to reducing pregnancies? And I think this gets back very directly to Sarah's last point, which is the need to test different models robustly and in different settings to be able to compare and contrast. I would say that it is possible that the communities, when they were having their discussions and coming up with what they thought was going to be the most effective approach for interventions, could have named child protection committees as a major component of the intervention. They didn't in this case, to my knowledge, and so that hasn't been a foundational part of this particular intervention, and as a result of what we actually measured. So in my mind, that's a beautiful example of of what Sarah is calling for other agencies to take on this the idea of looking at various models and doing robust evaluations and measurement, so that we do have a much broader evidence base to compare different types of models and interventions. Sarah, I'll let you respond to the logic model versus theory of change, and I will respond to Mark's question about the lessons learned on outcome indicators, or one specific lesson. For me, I think the process, to me, reminded me and shored up my belief in the need to develop culturally, contextually relevant indicators. I think many of us who are involved in programming or in research have had the experience where we take a tool to the field that's potentially been developed in New York or Geneva or Washington, and are met with sort of blank faces when a question is asked. And the power, I think, of using contextually relevant definitions is the meaning that those outcome indicators have to the participants, the respondents on the ground. Now, the flip side of that, I think, is thinking about and looking through different ways to overcome social desirability biases. So when a young person says that an important indicator of being a good child or being well is that they're very obedient, and you ask them questions on a survey about how obedient they are, that question is very relevant to them, and they know the certain standard way that they should respond to that. So I think thinking about creative ways to try to overcome social desirability biases to those contextually relevant questions is important to think through as well. And Sarah, I'll let you speak to the Ebola piece as well.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. So, okay, so Lindsay's already talked about question 1. I just wanted to add on the first one about child protection committees. This research did actually spring 4 or 5 years ago now, it was such a long time ago, out of discussions about child protection committees. So across our agencies we were implementing CPCs and we weren't sure whether they were really working. In this work in Sierra Leone, the ethnographic phase of the research did ask about child welfare committees, which are the equivalent of child protection committees in Sierra Leone. But it found that the child welfare committees only exist at kind of district level, so not at community level, and they weren't really very functional, and they weren't used by communities. So communities never said that if something happens in the community, they wouldn't go to the child welfare committee. They dealt with it very much through local chiefs and local leaders and through family responses. So one of the things it taught us about at least the district level child welfare committees was that they weren't really reaching to the community. They weren't linked with the community, and that was a kind of key finding really that influenced the design of the intervention that the communities came up with. Saying that, a part of the intervention that the communities designed is in fact a task group. So it's not called a child protection committee, but it is a group of volunteers at community level, young people and adults, who have been engaged in developing the work plan and taking it forward in the communities. So that didn't come from us, that didn't come from the facilitators, it came from the community members to have some form of a group. So I think one of the things it tells me is that if you create a group from outside, whether that's kind of by the government in country or whether it's by an NGO, it may not be used because it's kind of seen as an external thing. But if you give the community space to come up with their own work plan, it's possible, as in this case, that they will come up with something like a CPC, but it's completely owned by the community, and so it is used, and so it does actually seem to be more effective. So that's one of the things that I think I've kind of learned, I guess, about CPCs, or that I take away from this research. In terms of question 2 about the logic model, I think our theory of change is project level. So it describes kind of strategically, I guess, the whole, the theory behind the change that we expect to see across the whole project. What we could have done, I guess, is to develop logic models which show the connection between each of the different stages in a bit more detail. So as Lindsay showed in the diagram, we've demonstrated, we've laid out the interventions and the outputs and the outcomes, but we haven't gone into detail yet really about how all those things connect, why that particular output's going to lead to that particular outcome. Partly because that's what we're trying to test, and partly because that's just the way we did it. But I think we could do that, and I'm sure it would certainly be useful. And maybe that's something that when we kind of do our final data collection and when we reflect on the hypothesis of the theory of change, that's something that we might consider doing. So looking at why and how steps connected, if they did, or if they didn't, why our theory of change was incorrect, and perhaps which pieces of it didn't work as we'd expected, and which pieces did. So I don't know whether that's a full answer, but I think that's probably the most I can say on that at the moment. In terms of outcome indicators, I think Lindsay's lesson is a really important one, and I thought that's one, I really think he's highlighting that it is really useful to have culturally relevant indicators. As Mark mentioned at Save the Children, we have developed this kind of menu of global outcome indicators, which I think is helpful for signposting the kinds of things that you want to measure. But when it comes to actually, getting down to it in the field, in the context that you're working in, it is really important to make it contextually relevant and not just to kind of take from a global menu without any adaptation. So I think adaptation is a really important piece. And one lesson that I always think about anything to do with indicators really is that whenever you're thinking about developing an outcome indicator, you already need to be thinking in your mind about how am I going to measure that? What exactly does that mean? How is that defined? What is it I really want to find out, and how am I going to measure it? Because sometimes we can come up with indicators that can't be measured or are really unclear, and so I think it's always thinking really practically at every stage about how am I going to measure this indicator. That's, I guess, what drives me in my work on indicators. And then the final question about the Ebola response. I mean, I think at the moment it's a little bit early for us to say really what this intervention can tell us about, or any lessons or ideas we might apply to the Ebola response. The facilitators do have phone communication with the communities, or they did have. We heard from them a couple of weeks ago that they were still speaking on the phone to the community members, but they're not visiting anymore. So to some extent we're a little bit cut off from understanding what's happening in the communities at the moment. We have heard that the intervention is still continuing on a reduced scale, obviously, but that some things are still happening. I think only time will tell, really, whether that continues, depending on the impact on these particular communities, and whether the intervention that has been set up, whether it's helped or hindered in any way. So I think there's not much we can reflect on at the moment, but it is something that we'll obviously want to look at, as Lindsay said, when it's safe and appropriate to go back and to follow up with communities. We'll definitely be wanting to look at, did the community task groups actually support some of the Ebola response, or not? What were the communities doing, and is there anything about this community mobilisation process that supported the Ebola response? So I think that's probably about all I can say on that today. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Sarah. We do have 2 more questions and 4 more minutes, so I think we'll go ahead and ask them. But, on this point of Ebola, I also think it really is incumbent upon us who have this very rich and very detailed view of what's happening in some Sierra Leonean communities, what was happening prior to the outbreak, to share it so that people know that there is a very rich human life and tapestry of human life that's happening. And I say that because of a Guardian article that was published today. It's called Ebola as Seen Through the Eyes of a 13-year-old from Sierra Leone. And the girl says, if this Ebola does not end soon, many more girls will get pregnant before schools reopen, and that will be too bad for the future of children in this country. So here we have a young girl who's kind of right at the age of girls who are targeted by this intervention, speaking about how the Ebola virus is impacting the very issue that the community was choosing to deal with. So I think it is something we should bring back to ourselves and to the broader interagency team and say, how can we share what we do know about what communities are doing? Because we're sitting on a gold mine of information that very few people know about or have access to. The 25 of us on the webinar represent our respective organizations, but I think we really have a dissemination. I think the word is responsibility here. The 2 remaining questions are, first of all, I love this question. I love both of them. First, how did you deal with the ethical dilemma of using control groups? And this is something that comes up in every single piece of research that involves control groups. And I'll be very interested to hear how this particular process thought through that. The other one, many thanks for an interesting presentation. The questions are, to what extent did the intervention address gender norms and how these norms might perpetuate vulnerability to teenage pregnancy in these communities? And did the evaluation assess changes in gender norms? With that, I will turn it over for 2 more minutes, but I think we'll allow, we can go over a few minutes and people, of course, can get off if they need to. But Sarah and Lindsay, please, to these two wonderful questions.
Sarah, do you want to start this time?
Okay, sure. So on the ethics question, the design of this project is that following the T3 data collection, we were planning to replicate the intervention in the comparison communities. So this is a bit like, I don't know, you may have heard of an evaluation design called a step wedge design, which essentially means that your comparison community becomes an intervention community at a later date. So that's the idea, is to replicate the intervention in the comparison communities after the T3 data has been collected, which we were planning to do and start next year, but obviously things are a bit, we'll have to see when we can do that depending on the Ebola crisis. So I guess that's in some ways how we I've kind of looked at the ethical issue. So all communities will eventually get the intervention. It's just that some are getting it later than others. And because we don't know at this point fully, or we didn't know when we started, whether in fact the intervention model was even going to be effective. It's not the case that we were withholding something that was already proven to be effective from people. But we were kind of testing it, and then once it's proved effective, which hopefully it will be, we will then replicate it. So that's one of the considerations that's kind of underpinned the ethical review of the evaluation design, and we have gone through ethical review through the university and also in country in Sierra Leone through a specially formed group. So Lindsay may want to add on that, but that's, I guess, the main message from me on that question. And then the question around gender norms is really a good question, and one of my colleagues has kind of been questioning me about this as well, about this particular project, saying, you know, a lot of the intervention, the community work plan has come up, is about access to contraception and is about education of young people about sex, but at the moment the community hasn't explicitly identified the issue of gender norms and whether to what extent that's actually underpinning some of the teenage pregnancy, particularly in relation to sexual exploitation and kind of violence against girls that may be going on and sitting behind the pregnancy issue. So that hasn't come out explicitly yet, and I guess what the way we've been discussing it in the project team is that it's starting to come out in some of the community discussions. People are beginning to talk about gender issues and kind of power in the community, but it's definitely taking time. It's not the first thing that came out or the first thing that was discussed. So our view on it is that we anticipate, and I guess we're kind of hoping, that as time passes, by starting with some of the more kind of less sensitive issues around teenage pregnancy, like contraception, it will filter into a more nuanced discussion in the community about gender norms, which will also relate to teenage pregnancy. So that's, yeah, I think that's kind of where we are in terms of gender norms. Lindsay, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, really the only thing that I would add is in terms of the analyses and the reports, I mean, we have broken down the analyses both by age and gender to try to look at whether, you know, certain things are being reported more by females than males, or certain changes are being, you know, are happening more with certain age groups, and so you know, I think the example that I shared about increasing behavioral intent to use condoms regularly, you know, we found, for example, that that girls were reporting that, and so of course that implies negotiation and boys' willingness, and so I think there is, you know, a lot more to try to unpack and tease out, but we are certainly very, very aware of the, you know, the gender and developmental, you know, components, and are trying to break that down in the analysis as much as we can.
Well, thank you to both of you. Thank you to all of our attendees. Rich food for thought here today. And frankly, I say that with a bit of surprise because I've been following this process for many years and was expecting not to learn very much new today, but it always goes to show you that a new set of eyes on something that you've been overanalyzing can bring new issues to light. I think what I will take away from this is that we have a very serious responsibility not to stop this process because of Ebola, but to look at what we can learn from it that could support the efforts to combat Ebola and the effects of Ebola that may or may not be related to child protection. Many thanks to all. Again, you will be able to find this webinar eventually on the CPC Learning Network's YouTube channel, which I believe is youtube.com/CPC Learning, something like that. And you can also find all of the reports linked to this process, both on the CPC Learning Network's website, but especially with summaries and guidance documents on the Community Child Protection Exchange. Thank you also to our co-host, the Child Protection Monitoring and Evaluation Reference Group, and especially to our two presenters, Lindsay and Sarah. With that, I conclude the webinar, and thank you for your time today. We hope it's been useful to you.